Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Building a Virtuous Community with the Mainstay Foundation. We are really excited about this episode. On the show, we're going to be discussing a variety of different topics. As you know, building a virtuous community is about all those elements that lead up to a strong and vibrant community. Everything from social affairs, family matters, all the way through to civic engagement, media, entrepreneurship. All of those elements that we as a community need to endeavor in, get involved in order to build a strong and vibrant community. The topics that we've discussed thus far include spirituality as well as leadership. Today, we're going to start a very important conversation and one of the very important elements of developing a strong and vibrant community in North America, in Europe, and throughout the world. And tonight's topic is going to be about media and media engagement. How do we get involved? And to understand the importance of this topic, many have argued that there are three pillars to being a society, a community that is influential and has its voice heard in society. And those include finance, civic engagement, as well as media. On the finance front, we will be discussing in subsequent episodes the concept of entrepreneurship. How do we build and develop a strong and vibrant community, and in order to be able to sustain ourselves? That's the finance and entrepreneurship side. We're also going to be discussing civic engagement later down the road, and how can we get involved in the process, whether we are in Europe or America within our respective countries, of being represented appropriately and making sure that our voice is heard. As you may remember in our previous episode, Sayyid Hassan, our guest, mentioned that in speaking with some of the top scholars at the highest level, many of them have encouraged and said there is no problem in being involved, civically engaged, I should say, in our communities. And the third element, which we are going to be discussing tonight, is a pivotal discussion concerning media and media involvement. And this is part and parcel of making sure your voice, my voice, and our voices as a collective are heard by our representatives and our society at large. We, as members of the Muslim community, for instance, who speaks for us? Do we speak for ourselves? Do we have other individuals who speak for us? And at large, how does our representation impact our global society, our national society, as well as the international community? Who is speaking for us? This is part and parcel of this conversation. If you go back to the history of Europe as well as the history of America, you will find that media has often been called the fourth estate. If you go to, for example, the history of the United Kingdom, you will find that there was this idea of monarchs or kings and kingdoms. There was the idea of the nobility, the people who were not royalty, but just below it. And then there was the idea of the commons. And the idea of the fourth estate were those people, that was the media, which bridged the divide, that helped the common individual in the United Kingdom understand what's going on in the lives of the royalty and the nobility. When we come to America, it's often been said that there are three different branches of government. And in America, the fourth estate has been called media as well. That is, you have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. But additionally, you have the media branch, which actually helps to check the system that is in place. Nonetheless, there are many dimensions of media. And in particular, in today's modern era, we have social media, a game changer in the last several years or decade or so of time that has actually changed the dynamics of our world on a number of fronts. It has enabled us to create a platform where it may not have existed before. At the same time, it may not be all good and it may not be all bad. It may require a nuanced discussion. And we're going to be talking to our respective panelists on this very topic to see what are the pros and cons of media. We're also going to be talking about, is there a downside to media? And what is that if it's there? We're also going to be talking about how important media is and how, whether you realize it or not, whether you know it or not, the media has a tremendous impact in influencing how you and I operate in our world by molding and shaping public perception. That may be at the individual level, at the community level, at the national level, and beyond. The importance of this conversation cannot be overstated, because whether we know it or not, we are being impacted, either positively or negatively. We're also going to be talking about how can you get involved in media? Is there a path? You may be interested in media and you may want to get involved, but you don't know how to get on that journey and how to move along that journey. Where do you get started? We're going to be discussing this with our panelists as well. And a whole slew of other topics and conversations will be had on this front. I'm going to start turning to our panelists. I'd first like to welcome them. I'd first like to welcome Brother Salim Kassam from the Muslim Vibe. Perhaps needs no introduction. We have also, for our audience, detailed the biographies of our respective guests, and I invite you to take a look at those in the links attached or included. I'd like to welcome them. Brother Salim, assalamu alaikum. Thank you for being on with us.
Alaikum salam. Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. It's a real honor to have you on. And Brother Amir Taki, again, a brother who's been in the media and has been tremendously influential in this space. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Amir.
Alaikum salam, Sayyid Shabbir. And thank you for inviting me.
It's wonderful, wonderful to have you on. As Brother Amir has been very instrumental in our community and beyond, I should say, in his numerous documentaries, video productions, and different types of contents and channels that he's led over his career. So really excited to jump into this. I'm going to start off with Hajj Amir, and then I'll jump to Brother Salim on this issue. I want to first then start by actually discussing what is media. It's kind of a loaded term. Many people may be wondering, well, what does media mean? Does that mean the news? Does that mean social media? Our audience may have different concepts behind what we're talking about when we say media. So it may be fair to actually lay the groundwork and say, what are we talking about when we say media? So if you could shed some light on that, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Sayyid Shabbir, for the wonderful introduction. And I think you've chosen a really important topic today to discuss amongst the young people, as well as people watching from all ages. The question of media is it's really a tricky question because it's kind of continuously being redefined as we pass time. As you know, the modernization of the internet has kind of changed the way we consume media, we understand media. But in the basic aspects of it, media is about directing the masses towards important issues. That is kind of the basic brass of it. And so if you understand the mass media or the media organizations or mainstream media, when they were established, their kind of general consensus was that we are there to inform people about pertinent, important matters that relate to them. So that's why I think really, obviously now that's evolved because you have social media, you have, people journalism, people can speak out individually. You have now smaller platforms, you have niche platforms, you have religious channels, specific sect channels. So in essence, they all come relate to the same issue. It's about directing people to what is important. Now it comes back to the issue of what is important, and that's a debate that we can probably have during this discussion, inshallah.
Excellent, excellent. Very, very well stated. So it's a very broad demeanor and dynamic and subject, but we're going to narrow it down and refine it by talking about particular aspects in this conversation. Thank you for highlighting that. Coming to Brother Salim, I wanted to highlight a couple of things. From the Islamic perspective, media has been is something that may not have been addressed directly, but perhaps indirectly. If we look at some Islamic motivation around the topic and the idea, there's this idea of, for example, making sure that you're concerned with the affairs of the Muslims. We have the prophetic tradition that actually highlights that, if someone wakes up in the morning and they're not concerned with the affairs of the community, of the Muslim community at large, they are not a Muslim. فَلَيْسَ بِمُسْلِم. That person may not even be considered a Muslim in the grand sense of the word. So why is it important for us, defining this term media, why is it important for us to be aware and actually have a pulse of what's going on in our community, our society, our nations, and our world at large? Please.
Bismillah. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak with both of yourselves. And like Brother Amir said, I think it's a very important topic, and it's one of those things where when we talk about the media, it's like everyone knows the media, whatever. But I think understanding our relationship with the media, how we engage with it, is very important. So mentioning that hadith that you just brought up, I feel like it can be very easy for people to overlook or to brush aside, I guess, things that we see in the news, because often it's very grim, it's very negative, and can sometimes be quite difficult to stomach. But like you mentioned, we have this Islamic imperative that we have to keep up with the affairs of our brothers around the world. And we're blessed in a sense that the time that we live in it's a blessing and a curse, but it's one where, you know, information and news is accessible at the click of a button. Within seconds, you have information from the other side of the world traveling here. And you just think about on a community level with regards to finding out about someone passing away. Before, it would take a couple of days before news had made it out. And, you know, it was quite a slow process. Now, within minutes almost, everybody around the world has been alerted that an individual has passed away. And it's, as I said, it's provided us with an opportunity to be able to really engage with a much wider range of information and news, especially in so many different formats. And I think understanding and appreciating that is the first step. But then the second step is thinking about how we process that and what we do with the information. Because it's one thing to just consume and leave it there. But then it's about the next steps. And I think action is really important, and reflecting on our own process within that.
Very, very well said. Very well said. And I think understanding that dynamic is perhaps at the heart of this conversation. I'm going to come to Brother Amir, and then I want to actually come back to you, Brother Salim. I wanted to know your personal journeys as well. What brought you into media? Why did you consider a career in dedicating your life to this domain and this space of media, and perhaps maybe being trailblazers on this front before others may have even delved into it? Brother Amir, you want to highlight that? What brought you to media?
I think myself, I've been from a young age interested in always finding innovative ways to reaching the young, kind of young English-speaking communities. Living in the UK since 1993, I always wanted to speak to the people, younger people in the community who I felt could not understand the kind of native language that was spoken in the centers. And of course, I was, I find Islam as a true way of life, and I wanted to share that with people. And I find that sometimes the centers don't provide, especially the topics picked or the language used is not really conducive to the Western young mind who's grown up here, kind of trying to dabble with the idea of a second generation, parents can't speak English. And so they don't have an identity. And that's why I've always been fascinated by this. And I started with print media almost 20 years ago. I sound a bit old now, but when I was 16, I started a youth magazine. And we printed 5,000 copies and distributed it in different centers. And a lot of the people that were on the editorial board are now very active members of the community. So I later went into documentaries, and then obviously I was involved with Ahl Bayt TV for 10 years, essentially kind of in the role of a co-founder. I was involved in the establishment, the kind of outlined the production vision, how it was going to work, what content to film. And at that time, as you said, it was very primitive in terms of, in terms of English Shia Muslim media. It was very kind of, social media was non-existent. It was mainly television channels. And that's how we started. Obviously, the challenge was very difficult, but it comes down to the core point that I raised earlier, is if you are passionate about a story, if you're passionate about an element, then you should share it with people. So it kind of comes out to the brass of if you're going to carry knowledge, then you have to share it with people. That is kind of the common principle that Islam propagates, that you shouldn't just be a knowledge carrier. If you're passionate about social justice, if you're passionate about religion, if you're passionate about jurisprudence, theology, news, current affairs, justice, oppression around the world, whatever it may be, then that is what media allows you to do. It allows you to project your passions into a wider audience. You're effectively trying to spread that message and get everybody as engaged as possible. And the challenge then, and we can discuss it later, is that how do you do it effectively? How do you spread that message to the effectively in the right way? And so in our experience of almost 10 years, we had to travel around the world to all the continents, filming in America, in Africa, in Europe, Far East, Middle East, obviously. And, that brought us into a lot of experiences. We saw a lot of things. But to us, really, it was the core motivation for me is that how could I tell people about Islam in a way that they haven't experienced it before. The tool of the media that we have now allows us to tell stories differently. Maybe 100 years ago, it wasn't the same. And even in 100 years' time, the way content is projected will be different. And, maybe books or publishing was something, 50, 150, 100 years ago. But now, obviously, everyone knows that reading is on the down, or people do listen to audiobooks. So really and truly, it's about looking at what is impactful. And media, by that time, is and was and still is one of the most important ways of reaching your message. Now, obviously, media now has again, it's developed, it's moved forward a lot. It's allowed people to establish their own YouTube accounts. They can make their own videos. People are making a living on YouTube now. They produce their own content. So really, it's a very vast. So my journey really is here, and it's something that I'll continue to do, inshallah, in the years to come with many different projects.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that personal journey. And it seems like you started really young, and the impact it kind of. And what's really interesting about that is that you started when there may not have even been a platform, right? You're starting at 16 and creating content. So I think that's a lesson for our audience and all of us, that you don't have to wait for the opportunity. Maybe you can just create it. And I think that may come up in the social media conversation. Brother Salim, could you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got into the media space? I think that may be interesting to our audience.
So despite competing with Amir in terms of white hairs, I'm a little bit younger than him. So Amir is an example of somebody that definitely, I think, was trailblazing from day one, and has always been, at the forefront of these kind of initiatives and things in the community. My journey is slightly different. So after university, I set up a digital marketing company with my business partner, and we basically, I think, we hadn't studied marketing, and we hadn't kind of gone down that from an academic perspective, but growing up on social media, and I think having a Facebook account at the age of 13, and then adopting Twitter and Instagram, and Vine, if people remember, Vine had a very short shelf life, but was around at some point. Experiencing all of these in real time and understanding trends, we found ourselves as knowing the space, and then being able to provide that as a service for our customers, for clients. And we were doing that. So we were doing social media marketing. But, as Amir said, there was a time when companies didn't realize they needed social media. So what we were doing early days was actually educating our clients about why they needed to be on these platforms. And then about a year and a half into it, we kind of thought, okay, this is great. Alhamdulillah, we're putting food on the table at home, but we also want to create something or use our skills to be of benefit to the Muslim community. To leave to leave something by way of a legacy, or just impact and use our skills to change the digital narrative of Muslims in the West. And that's pretty much where the idea for the Muslim Vibe came from. But prior to that, we had both been involved in various different kind of community initiatives and everything else. But it was at that point where we kind of merged our professional skills and area of interest, and also our passion for the community, and came up with the Muslim Vibe. And I think, when Amir is talking about his experience over the years and the various projects at Ahlul Bayt TV as an example, I think it's incredible to see the journey that we've come on as a community, and that the timing of everything has been very, I think, significant and important. So we started, I think, 6 years ago now. And at that point, and still now today, social media plays a huge and pivotal role. But even the framing of our platform today is very different to how it was when we launched, if that makes sense. So you've got TikTok as an example of a social media platform that we currently don't exist on. And it's still like we're trying to come to terms with it. Should we be on it? Should we not? But the thing that I think people today are starting to appreciate, and even in terms of traditional publishers and TV channels and everybody else, is that social media plays a key role now in disseminating information and promoting and marketing and whatever else. And so I think it's important that anyone kind of thinking about this space is trying to be right at the sort of the heart of things. So it's, it's really keeping up with trends and everything else, and it's just a constantly evolving game. Like Amir said, right? It's constantly changing, and we just need to adapt and get involved. But yeah, that's a brief insight into my own personal journey, I guess.
Excellent. So I know we have viewers on both sides of the pond in the North America as well as in Europe. So I want to just kind of give the American perspective. I'd love to hear on the European perspective from you. Maybe I'll have to give this to Salim, and then I'll hear from Amir on this as well. That the idea is, look, when America was founded, it was basically in the foundation that there was a freedom to press. That was just part of the Constitution of the United States. And it was enshrined in that you need a free and fair press in order to operate a democracy. That's just part of the nature of the beast. And there are examples. For example, if we go to the era and time of Teddy Roosevelt, the US president, they were able to solve many challenges. The meat companies, trusts were becoming huge conglomerates which had a tremendous amount of power. And they were controlling dynamics, the prices and things of this nature. And by using the press in a positive way, they were actually able to be a force for change in order to help the common individual on the ground. But this is the American narrative about what press is and what's the importance of press in a democracy. How do people in Europe, and in particular in England, see the press? What's the relationship between media, the press, and journalism for the European, or particularly the English Republic?
So it's very interesting, because obviously we discussed this just a little bit before, and I think the way that things are framed in America is always extremely different to how things are framed elsewhere. So it's we know this freedom of speech and freedom of expression and democracy and all these like grandiose terms. We don't think in those terms in the UK. I think that there is this appreciation in the UK that we have freedom of press, and we have. I think when people think about the media here, we think about the left wing, the right wing, and the kind of middle ground, or whatever that is. I think fundamentally everybody knows that even amongst the tabloids and the mainstream journalistic platforms in the UK, there are kind of lines that there are sides that people are on. So some are more left leaning, some more right leaning, and people very interestingly gravitate towards the platform of their choosing, and then chooses to kind of embody those values. So we have stereotypes about Daily Mail readers, or The Sun readers, or Guardian readers, or Telegraph readers, which generally I think remain quite true. And even like in terms of how people vote, it's very segmented to an extent based on what mainstream media platform they consume. I think interestingly, the direction that we're going in now is towards this, like Amir mentioned right at the beginning, this kind of citizen journalism or independent journalism, where we have the advantage of platforms being, or I guess the playing field being leveled, where nowadays anybody can start a website, anyone can start a Twitter account, a Facebook page, whatever it might be, and start producing content or start reposting content or whatever. And it's just about how appealing the content is, that people might consume it or not. As I said, coming back to kind of the original notion that you put out, it's framed very differently. I think media plays a hugely important role and is at the forefront of everything nowadays. But it's not seen with that kind of there's no patriotism attached to our media here. I don't know. I mean, Amir, tell me if I'm getting it wrong. But yeah, it's a different framing, I think.
Yeah, please, Amir, do jump in on this. Like, how is media perceived on the other side of the pond?
So we have a unique setup in the UK. And, we have something called the TV license, whereby we pay a certain amount of money per year, and majority of that goes towards the BBC. And that, I think the BBC has a budget of £5 billion roughly per year. I'm not sure if someone might correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a humongous budget that they have, and that allows them to, of course, not charge advertising. Now, the remit that the BBC has is quite different. They tend to produce content without really considering the commercial aspect of it. So sometimes they would spend a huge amount of funds on documentaries, to discuss evolution, or for example, discuss the changing aspects of the planet, and they would spend, you know, £1 million with a documentary, but they would air it, you know, they would air it once. So there is a kind of a huge backing for the BBC, and of course Channel 4 receives a partial amount of that funding as well. So the essence of that the media is free, is there to account and keep the politics at check, or keep the government at check, is very fundamental. But I think really that we're scoping the media into a very small pigeonhole. Really and truly, it's not just news that we're concerned about. The media is what you consume, you know, what comes on TV, and news is a very small portion of, you know, you have this whole huge empire of dramas and documentaries and animations and cartoons and children's content, and that is really I mean, before we had only 5 channels in the UK, we had 4, then they put Channel 5, and now the options are you know, magnanimous. You can choose, there's thousands of channels to pick from. There's on-demand facilities, there's paid versions, there's free versions of on-demand, like Netflix or YouTube, and so on and so forth. So the challenge with all of that, and I just want to come to a point that I'm really be concerned about, is that the whole of the world media, in essence, if it was there and set up initially as a voice, or as a way to ensure that people are directed towards the truth, or the media is there to discuss important aspects or important issues. I feel like now the media has moved towards a very commercial perspective, and they're there to sell either newspapers or to ensure they have high ratings, and that's why, you know, it's all about sensationalism. And this is really the biggest downfall for media, because generally human beings, they're attracted to war, they're attracted to fury, they're attracted to sex, and generally it's like our attraction to sugar and salt and fat, and you know, just people just want to know, and that's why these clickbait articles have been, you know, go around, they get millions of views. Content is controversial, news headlines are controversial, and you can see that developing, and that really puts the kind of the worldview into a risk, because everybody is being driven with a very liberal kind of understanding of life, and for you to veer off that discussion or that perspective or that paradigm, you're straight away frowned upon. And kind of, you know, this is why you have these social media plays a good role in one essence by providing an alternative view. So for example, I don't know if I can mention his name, but big newspaper proprietors that own multiple channels or multiple newspapers, they essentially control a certain narrative, and it's very difficult for us to have an alternative narrative without having these small, without us engaging media through social media or through websites or through content that we create. So really and truly, I just feel like media is such a humongous, huge dinosaur, and that we don't know how to tame, and it's very difficult. It's roaming around within our communities, and it's propelling a certain amount of content, not just solely about Muslims. That's it's not about news. It's about the content that is kind of broadcast on these lenses. It sometimes really is not conducive to a Muslim identity, and that's where the problem.
So, sorry, if I can just jump in and just add to what Amir is saying, I 100% agree. I think, if we broaden the conversation, and you mentioned platforms like Netflix as an example, I think what is happening nowadays very well on the sort of the part of the kind of liberal agenda, let's say, is that content is being put out where the moral values are determined by the content creators, and as mass consumption takes place, this becomes the norm. So I think that's the thing. And like Amir is saying, when you look at things that are at odds with Muslim values, it's very difficult when all of our kids' friends, for example, are watching a particular show, and there are problematic elements in it, be it sex, violence, language, whatever it might be. And you don't want your kid to feel left out by not letting them watch it, but then by them watching it, they're consuming that, and that kind of the morality or lack of is something that will also permeate into them. And I think that's the worrying thing, that like we live in this age where there's this desire and this need for us to consume media so rapidly and with such sort of ferocity that we're not stopping to think about what this impact this is actually having on us. And it's quite a scary notion, I think, to be honest.
I think those are some very, very power points from both of you there on a lot of fronts. I want to tie this in with the idea or the concept of Islamophobia, right? There's been a lot of data that shows that if you want to eradicate Islamophobia, one of the best things that you can do is befriend a non-Muslim. If you're a Muslim yourself, befriend a non-Muslim, and in America in particular. Most Americans don't know a Muslim. They may know a Muslim by name, but they may not actually have a relationship with one. So if you don't really have that relationship, it's very easy to manipulate that narrative through whatever means. So just becoming a friend, one Muslim and one non-Muslim becoming friends can reduce Islamophobia by 50%. The reason I'm saying that, and to tie into Amir's point about media being much broader than just news or newspapers or things of this nature, shows, that is television shows, have done more for causes of certain communities, have done a lot more than even the news. Like if I tell you a statistic about something, it may not hit and resonate as much as seeing a TV show. The example that's cited is a show called Will and Grace that did much more for one particular community than it did for a lot of other, things didn't do it for them. Similarly, having a show that shows Muslims in a positive light as a natural family, that is just part and parcel of the fabric of the United Kingdom or the fabric of America, can go a long way to normalize things. And obviously on the opposite end of that, programs on Netflix or any other platform for that matter, that paint Muslims, for example, in a negative light, can have a tremendous impact on how people perceive them, either consciously or subconsciously. So I think that's a really, really important point. And I want to kind of get into that. And you guys highlighted something. I'd read a book by Ryan Holiday called Trust Me, I'm Lying. It was like Confessions of an Media Insider. And he was talking exactly about this idea of how blogs have emerged. And the idea was that, advertising and advertisements, you can it's all become commercialized in some sense. And so it's not even about being right, it's about who's first. And verification becomes a challenge and a problem. I remember reading about a group of guys who actually put out a false statement on the internet. And they just wanted to see how easy it was to get this to circulate and become normalized. And they literally went online and posted something that the average adult eats 4 or 5 bugs during their lifetime. While they're sleeping or whatever it may be. And then this started circulating, people started believing in it, and it became normalized to the point that people were sharing it and like, oh my God, I didn't know that. And so I guess coming to this point, what is our responsibility? Maybe I can take this to Amir. What is our responsibility as members of the community in terms of making sure that information is valid and verified? Because there's a surge of AI coming. And in fact, I've been reading that with AI and artificial intelligence, it may even become very difficult for the common individual to understand what is true and what is fake news, so to speak, because the AI engines will put them out so quickly. So I guess what I'm getting at here is there's the problem here, but at the same time, what can our responsibility be in this environment in order to try to address these things so we are making sure that there's accurate information out?
So again, it's a two different discussions. One discussion, if it's news based and there's kind of that messaging, that hidden messaging within. You mentioned Netflix, and there's so many examples that took place. Either impacts politics, like we had the Brexit issue, and the whole kind of how news was used, or how headlines were used to, in essence, kind of sway votes. And you got the issue of the programming that's innately problematic. They had the issue of a program, a big uproar about it, which was to do with pedophilia on Netflix. I can't remember the title. I'm sure people are aware of this, but this normalization of these issues is deeply troubling. And the question is, what can we do about it? So I think the first thing we have to admit is that media is, as a whole, television, kind of brings to our home a wide range of content. And that content, previously, you know, we could somehow before insulate our families, educate them, and then slowly introduce this. But by the age of 5, 6-year-olds, they're having access to tablets and they can just go on to different shows, they're on YouTube. And parents are having to play this police role in the house, whereby they, you know, they've given their kids tablet time and it's 1 hour, you can only do this and do that. And really and truly, it's almost impossible to manage that. And really the one solution that we can do is two aspects we can do. One is very important for us to spend time with our children. Obviously, I'm talking about young families because, you know, once someone understands their faith and they expose to certain elements, they will be able to decipher how to deal with that. But when it comes to young people, it becomes very difficult. And that's why educating or dealing with our children, spending time with our kids, making sure they understand the correct elements is very, very important. The other aspect of it is, of course, is that people are not going to abandon social media or media. And that's why we have to be also at the forefront in content creation. We have to be at the forefront and being very innovative. We have to be very creative. We have to be aesthetically pleasing. We have to look at our scripting has to be at the best. And all these elements come together to produce some kind of, if not alternative, but some kind of content that can satisfy people. Studies have come around and they said, why do people watch TV? And why do people, you know, sit down and watch? And when I mean TV, you got these, you know, like, what's that guy called in America? Steve Harvey. You know, they have this Family Fortune, very popular show, and we have that here as well. Why do people watch that? The questions are very ridiculous. You know, what 5 things you enjoy about Steve Harvey, for example? I don't know if I can mention his name, but anyway, we'll figure that out after. But the interesting element here is that a lot of the TV that we consume is not necessarily interesting. It's just to pass time and to fill. And studies have looked at this, and it's really shocking that they've come to the understanding that us consuming this information is one way of us escaping ourselves. We just because we don't want to account our actions or we don't want to deal with our daily issues, to get away from our worries, we sit down and watch hours of content that is irrelevant, you know, meaningless, and potentially harmful to our soul, to our identity, just so that we don't think about, you know, our issues. We don't think about our problems. We run away from this. We put the control on, and suddenly we're just different world. We're laughing, we're chilling, and this is deeply problematic because Imam Sadiq says that if you do not review yourself every evening, you're not one of us. It's obviously, you know, it's not like that cutthroat, if I would say, but generally speaking, if you look at it from the kind of general meaning of it, is that you need to be reflective. And so their media plays a very critical role in deferring you from that. And more so, and I don't want to keep talking, but more so the issue of social media and the issue of phones. You know, we probably spend, I don't know if you've got iPhones are telling you how many hours you're spending on your screen per week. It tells you. I'm not going to reveal mine because I'm quite, I'm ashamed of it, but it's a big number, right? And of course, a lot of work happens on phones. You know, we use WhatsApp to communicate with friends and family. But sometimes when we get to Facebook or we get to platforms like Instagram, the way they're built, the algorithms there, is that they're there to keep you watching content, and they watch, you know, it's either comedy or cooking or whatever it may be, something to hook you in, because if they hook you in for the longest period possible, advertisers will pay them money to get on that platform. And so it's designed to make you addictive to the platform. So it's very, very worrying. Obviously the work that Salim does and the work that I do, it cannot compare to the work that's been out there. You know, it's we're irrelevant. We're so small. Our content is mainly educational, inspirational. That's the kind of, they do dramas and comedy and stuff that, you know, everybody wants to watch. So really, it's a big challenge. Even if you compete with them in content, it's not enough. You may have to make sure you have to educate your community so that when they get exposed to it, they're able to, you know, consume it, take what's good, and push aside what is not.
Excellent. Thank you for shedding light on that aspect. Salim, I wanted to come to you on this. I was reading the book News by Alain de Botton, a philosopher, and he was talking about this idea of when you look at the news and you look at our dynamics, and sociologists have talked about this for some time, that the news can actually make us it can make us actually anxious and depressed about our society. And the reason that can happen is because the news discusses anomalies in society, aspects that are like extremes, robberies, shootings, killings, these types of things. But at the same time, there may be a positive element of the news. And that's something that we may want to consider and may want to take on board. I want to take the example of economic news, for example, right? A lot of times it's focused on, for example, numbers, like, a 3-month running average and metrics that are focused and geared towards investors, people who may be subscribing to some of these channels. But behind these, there are actually lives and implications. If I can use the example of COVID in our world today, there were over 100,000 cases in the United States and over 400 and about 472. I actually remember the number when I was looking at the news just the other day of deaths, 472, almost 500 people died. And sometimes we can get lost in the statistics. Those are 472 families. Those are not just individuals or statistics, if you will. Those are people that are impacted. So Salim, in journalism, where is that balance, if you will, in terms of the lives impacted and telling the stories of individuals versus getting caught up in the metrics and the statistics and kind of glancing over things? Where does media responsibility fall into this?
So before I address that, actually, you made an interesting point earlier about Islamophobia and representation, and you cited the example of Will and Grace. There's actually an interesting initiative that's been set up in the UK called the Riz test. So it refers to Riz Ahmed. And basically the test is this, that you take a film or a show that you're watching, and if the show has at least one character who's identifiably Muslim by their ethnicity, language, or clothing, you ask the following 5 questions. So is the character talking about the victim of or the perpetrator of terrorism, presented as irrationally angry, presented as superstitious, culturally backwards, or anti-modern, presented as a threat to a Western way of life, or if the character is male, is he presented as misogynistic, or if female, is she presented as oppressed by her male counterparts? Now, if the answer to any of the above is yes, then the film or TV fails the test. Now, it sounds quite simplistic, and there is I think it's called the Barbra Streisand test, which is what they derived this from, which was about female representation a lot earlier, like many years ago, in the media, in terms of how female characters were portrayed on scene. And one of the criteria for that test is if there are 2 women in a scene, do they even talk to each other, or do they just talk to the men? And what's fascinating is that when you run this test through TV shows or films that you watch, you'll find so many of them fail. So the website, if you Google the Riz test, you can see their website, and on there, they actually have reviews that I think people submit where they've reviewed films and spoken about these elements. And it's fascinating that, representation is important, but just having a visibly Muslim person on screen doesn't mean representation. It can be negative representation, like in the examples cited by this. But I think, yes, I think we do need representation in the media, but it needs to be the right kind of representation. Now, in terms of responsibility, I think it's interesting when you were talking at the end and you were asking about the numbers. I think what's really interesting from our side is that, when we're putting together an article or a video or a podcast or whatever it might be, you're kind of weighing up 2 things. On the one side, you're like, what can we do to maximize engagement and clicks and everything else? And then at the same time, you're thinking about what's our social responsibility. And we found ourselves in a position where, like you were saying, when we have negative news stories, especially about Islamophobia, things that kind of feed and fuel that anger inside people about the state of things today, that does well. Like, people click on that, they engage with that, they share that, because there's a real kind of anger there. So it's very easy to go down that route. But I've in speaking to people, I've had feedback, and people are like, oh, it's always just negative news you guys push out. And we have a responsibility when, we're at a stage where our platform currently, we have, I think, a following of just over 1 million across our social media networks. And so within that, there are 1 million people, in fact, well, many more because people share and engage, but at least 1 million people who subscribe to our content, who expect or who are trusting us to paint the narrative for them. So it's very easy for us to sensationalize and make things, really extreme, whichever way it might be. But actually, there's that importance that, you don't want people to be on edge. You want people to be happy. You want people, you need to represent obviously what's happening, but at the same time, the way that you phrase things, the language that you use, and the framing of it's really important. I think, we're lucky that when we operate in an independent media space and we control the narrative, we're able to have that impact. My fear is that, when you talk about, especially in the UK, the tabloid media, you have certain newspapers that are known for shocking headlines. So there was one sensational headline that was, they had to apologize about after a short while, but it was something like 1 in 5 Muslims support jihad or something like that. I can't remember. It was quite an inflammatory title. And then the apology they did, weeks later was on like page 13 in like a bottom corner, and it was that big. And that was, the media regulators holding them to account. But there is that fundamental duty, I think, that we have when we're in the media space to act responsibly. But that's more of a personal duty than anything. And I think the worry is that if people don't have their own kind of moral compass and code, which they abide by, then it's like anything is game, right? And we have tabloid papers in the UK whose sole aim it is to find out the juicy information as quick as possible. And they've been caught wiretapping people's phones, doing all sorts of things. And all they do is they'll chastise the individual journalist, kick them out, but the news entity still exists. So there is a huge problem, I think, when it comes to that space. But it's an ongoing battle, I think.
I think you highlighted some really important elements of the equation. You reminded me that same book that I mentioned earlier, Trust Me, I'm Lying, Ryan Holiday, he actually highlighted the blogs. There's been data collected on this, and there are certain emotions that when invoked, tying in with Amir, with what Amir was saying about, the focus, what's the goal here? For it, the goal depends on the platform, right? So if I have a startup, I have a particular goal or something like that. If my goal is profit maximization, there's going to be certain things that I look for. So he actually mentioned in that book that anger has been shown to trigger action. So if there's a headline or a title that elicits anger in the viewer or the reader, they will take action. Followed by fear. If there's something that induces fear, people want to protect themselves from fear and they'll click on that. They actually found that sadness is not very motivating. So sadness is actually one of the lower rungs. So if something evokes sadness, people may stay away from that. So what I want the audience to perhaps consider from that, this is down to a science for a lot of different entities and outlets. So at some level, there may be an element of manipulation going on, whether we realize it or not, in order to get us to take action in a particular way, in a particular manner. And that's understanding the psychology. So I wanted to tie that in with the book Hooked, which is a well-known book in Silicon Valley that actually talks about how to make your app or your technology device as addictive as possible. And this is something that is part and parcel of this Silicon Valley startup culture. You need to know that there needs to be a trigger. There has to be something that evokes this emotion. And there's a cycle that lets you rinse and repeat. It's not a coincidence that, when you're bored and waiting for, the tube or the subway in New York or the tube in London, that you pull out your phone and you start, just tapping away. That's really ingrained in the psychology. So Amir, I wanted to kind of build on that idea, knowing all of these elements. As somebody who is in the community, if there's somebody who's watching here who actually wants to be a force for change in our community and actually wants to change the dynamics, say on an issue like poverty, or let's say mental health, for example, they see a problem in society and they want to help address it. What advice would you give to that person about what they could do? Could they perhaps, consider creating a documentary, a small clip, creating social media? What would you recommend for them to do if they want to raise awareness about a topic, such as mental health, for example, and actually foster and catalyze change? You're muted, Amir. Can we hear you? I think we got you muted.
I'm going to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Please, go ahead.
I think, of course, young people who want to make a change about issues they feel very passionate about, the first thing to do is obviously read up as much about it as possible. There's no point being a commentator or trying to discuss something when you don't really understand it. And of course, platforms like Twitter, if you're posting something very kind of relevant or you're posting something which is very well researched, then people will kind of gravitate towards you. That's how it works. That's how you stand out compared to other people. Obviously, if you're just ranting, then it's not going to really have an impact. And once you understand the topic, then you can start. Obviously, I think you should start small by potentially tweeting about things. Creating threads about certain topics. Then you got, if you feel very confident, then you can move towards vlogging. You can create a YouTube account and start posting a video once a week, twice a week. Pick a topic that you think is relevant, spend 5-6 minutes on it, record yourself on your phone, get yourself a nice microphone, some lighting set up, and speak and articulate your views. Obviously, make sure it's structured and it's effective. Then you can straight away move into a platform like the Muslim Vibe. There's other platforms available. People, obviously, they allow you, they look for writers and people that have interest in certain topics, and they have editors who can improve the standard and the quality of your writing, obviously. So you just have to give it a go. You have to just kind of, I'm assuming that's right, Salim. I'm not going to kind of
yeah. No,
I'm not folding. I'm not going to send you forward to you for. He says, sorry, we've got a different policy. So just generally speaking, you can obviously touch upon that after. But once you kind of do that, that will take you a couple of years to do that. And once you do, then you really then you find where your skills lie. If it's in video, or if it's in writing, or it's whatever you feel comfortable with. And documentaries are very complicated projects. You need a big budget and a team and whatnot. But writing straight away will give you that. And then suddenly you become an expert or something. You become someone who people refer to. You might get invited to events to talk about this issue. You might be able to contact a production house and say, I would like to work with you as a volunteer. I'm a researcher. I would be a runner. And that's how you get in. You need to kind of just be very persistent. And if you make that intention, you eventually can get in. But I just want to discuss, so add a second point to what you said, Sayyid Shabbir, and I think the issue of the whole debate of should we then bother with mainstream media? Should we kind of, what's the point? These guys have a skewed agenda, they're commercially driven, they're kind of very much into very liberal values, they promote non-Islamic concepts. Why are we engaging them? Let's let them be, and we just live in our own circle. And I think, Sayyid, you mentioned a very important issue, is that in America, they're asked to befriend one person and who's a non-Muslim, and just educate them about Islam. I was speaking to an American commentator a few days ago, and I said to him, listen, what's the problem in America? Why is there so much? Why is there 70x million voted for one guy and another 74 million voted for another guy, and they're both polar opposites? And they say there's a lot of ignorance in America. There's a lot of issues where people have not been, they need to be educated, and really the onus is down to us. And so sometimes being in these big institutions, although they have a huge agenda, and whoever they may be, but you being there, you may gain the experience and eventually be able to influence. So it's a really two-pronged attack. Start with local journalism, get involved in local, Muslim or non-Muslim small, websites that have a very good reach, and you can easily get in if you're good enough, and then work your way up. And really, it's about passion, being passionate about a certain topic. If you really believe in something, I met one of the best producers, one of the best directors. His name is Michael Wood. He's produced a number of documentaries, including Shakespeare, 3 parts. He's done the history of Alexander the Great. He's done the history of India, the history of China. And obviously, one of his most famous documentaries was Saddam's killing fields, which outlined the massacre that took place in Karbala and across Iraq in the 1991 uprising. He was given exclusive footage of that attack. If you remember the car driving towards a shrine, that famous footage was given to him, and he used that in the documentary. And so I said to him, what did you graduate in? Interesting enough, he's a big filmmaker, and he gets commissioned by the BBC and big channels. I've done Anglo-Saxon history from Cambridge University. It was Oxford University. I'm not either one, but it's from a top university studying something like history. And obviously he's taken his passion, and he said, I want to share this. I want to make history accessible to people. And he's taken very complicated. I tell the story to everybody. When I went to his office one day, and he had a bookshelf in his room, and there was at least 100 books on the Quran. I said, wow, Michael, you're really into the Quran. He said, I'm thinking about doing a documentary about the Quran, so I want to get through these first before pitching something to the BBC. And so, he has to engross himself into something so well that if you're going to talk about it, you have to be an authority. And it's very difficult, but that's the type of person we need to be. Essentially, you're like becoming a scholar in that field, and you have the passion about telling that story to people.
So if I can jump straight in, if that's all right, because I think I see the world very differently from Amir. In that when it comes to this stuff, I think maybe it's an age thing, and we're not that far apart in age, but I think generationally, I feel really bad phrasing it this way. But no, what I'm getting at is that the generation that I'm from, people jump into things. People to change their bio on Instagram and suddenly they're a poet or they're a entrepreneur or whatever they want to be. And I think now is the perfect time to use the internet to your advantage. Do some online free courses. YouTube has an abundance of resources, and if you want to become a graphic designer, you can learn graphic design on your own. Back in the day, you had to have someone teach you or whatever else. If it's video,
you can't be a graphic designer when you're on. Come on, Salim. Let's be honest. Hasim's going to get very upset when he hears this part, by the way.
No, but what I mean is that the basic skills you can learn, even video editing, for example, you can learn the basic skills, whereas before, a lot of this was very inaccessible. Whereas now, a lot of the technology is open source and you can learn bits for yourself. And like Amir said, there are platforms like ours where we do accept content, be it written or otherwise, where it can be the sort of the sort of first steps to getting out there. I think where we kind of fundamentally differ for myself anyway is that I believe, and this is probably like almost like a separate conversation, but I believe that when it comes to talking about media platforms, unless we are at the top, unless we're decision making, I think there's very little or limited influence and impact that we can have. Yes, we can sway a narrative or have like a slight impact, but ultimately, if we're not the ones pulling the strings, then we're always going to be swimming against the tide if our own kind of sensibilities and agendas aren't aligned. So I think whilst I do at the same time believe it's important we have individuals in those institutions, because yes, there is damage limitation that can be done and there are things that can be progressed. At the same time, it's not for me, because I feel like you're always going to be limited in that capacity. Whereas when we own the platforms, when we control the narrative, we can do what we want, say what we want, obviously for the greater good. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that we're able to grow our platform on our terms and get across our narrative. And something Amir said, almost, I think, probably 45 minutes ago, about the need to diversify our content. So it's not just about creating Islamic or religious programming or having discussions and debates that are centered around that or around Muslim culture, but we need to start really pushing things out there. So in terms of all of the arts, I think there needs to be a push. And for me, that's a generational conversation, because we need the support of our parents to be okay with us not being doctors and dentists and engineers and all the usual stuff, but to appreciate and embrace the need for the arts, because they have a huge cultural impact on general discourse around Muslims in the West, for example. So it's a huge space that's growing, and I think conversations like this are important, but people that are listening and watching need to kind of step away and assess their own involvement and engagement in this space and their own perspective as well. Like, if your son or daughter came to you and said, I want to be a journalist, or I want to be an artist, or I want to be a poet or whatever, what's your response going to be? Because these are, even comedians, for example, these are very serious career paths that have huge social change and impact, or can have, but if done in the right way and if supported by family and friends and community and everything else. So yeah.
Very interesting. So I wanted to kind of give this another tack on to this, Salim, if I may. with respect to a couple things, and we've got a bunch of questions trickling in, so we're going to get to those in a second. People are really engaged and interested on this topic on both ways. And that's really the crux of our conversation here. We're not here to tell you who to vote for. We're not here to tell you which media outlet to watch. We're here to just say, get involved in the process as in whatever capacity you are interested in doing so. Having said that, I want to talk about this concept from an Islamic perspective, and I want to get your perspective a bit on what's the responsibility and the ethics of media. And I'd love to hear from Amir on this as well, about this idea of within Islam, character assassinations. This has become the norm. In the same book I had mentioned earlier, News by Alain de Botton, he talked about this concept of, in the past, in the Greek era, athletes, whether it was gladiators or, for example, it was people who were politicians or renowned orators of society, they were also painted in a positive light. Yes, perhaps occasionally negative, but there were positive things that came to the forefront. However, in today's modern society, especially when it deals with politicians and others, there's a lot of character assassinations that may take place, and that may be important at some level for accountability. Maybe not the character assassination part, but at least holding people accountable. From the Islamic aspect, there's a lot of dimensions of, for example, backbiting, riba, or for example, buhtan, for example, like slander. So backbiting being something that may even be true, however, you're not to share it, or slander, something that's not even true, and yet you're spreading things like this, namima, and other aspects of spreading things that may not be true or talking about people. Now, when it's dealing with a tyrant or someone who's oppressing society, that the rules shift. It doesn't necessarily have the same things applying. But with respect to a journalist or someone in the media, what's the responsibility of making sure that someone's character is preserved, yet at the same time balancing that with bringing the truth to the light? What would you say about that?
So if I'm being honest, I'm glad you said that you would tackle the Islamic side and I would provide like a more journalistic perspective, because I think, for me, I make the personal calculation of, if someone is doing something in public life, then it's important that we, or is an entity in public life, and it's important that we're aware of who that individual is. And if he does something, for example, contrary in his private life, which becomes public, you have to make that calculation as to whether that's relevant or not. I think it's interesting you didn't mention cancel culture, but that's basically the culture that we live in today, right? Where someone puts one foot wrong, or even someone claims that somebody has put 1 foot wrong, and suddenly that person is cancelled. And no one wants to know or hear about this person ever again, and won't trust them or whatever. But even that, I think, has a very short shelf life, where very quickly someone can bounce back. But it's a weird time that we live in, because I've seen firsthand people's reputations been ruined by anonymous tweets that are often unfounded, with no evidence and no proof, but that's enough to pull someone down. I think key to all of this, number one, is evidence and proof, and always, and like from a perspective of when we have a story, and there's always that thing, right? You're always rushing against the clock. So when you find out a piece of information, you're like, can we verify this? No, okay, but and you're trying to constantly make excuses. But I think verifying information is so important from a journalistic perspective, and making sure you get your facts right. And so it's something that whenever there's something that we want to get out, for example, but we're unsure of, you have to use the terminology like allegedly, supposedly, reportedly, so you're not misleading. But at the same time, we're also making the calculations. And in fact, like as a platform as well with the Muslim Vibe, we've always we've recently started to take the approach where we don't want to be at the forefront of things. We want to be at the analytical end of things. So rather than trying to break a story, let a story unfold. Let's see what happens, and then let's talk about the different ramifications. Let's talk about the how people have reacted to this. And number one thing I've always found is that when we've done that, we found ourselves being a lot more reflective and nuanced in our response, because in the heat of the moment, and there's been instances in various communities. I think I've lost you guys. Are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. You were both frozen in time, but it's all good. I think you're both just looking down at the same time. So yeah, when there's been in the heat of the moment, things happen, and suddenly as a community, you kind of don't really know what's going on. It's all a bit frantic. Responses are all over the place. People are releasing statements. People are saying this, that, and there's theories left, right, and center. But then as time goes on and you get clarity on a matter, suddenly it becomes a lot more apparent what the appropriate response is and how to talk about it, and actually what the facts are. So I think facts, as I said, is what's really important. And it's unfortunate that, you mentioned the term fake news. We all know the origins of where that term became popular. We live in an era where, you have individuals as heads of state, and fake news has sprung up from there. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of, for me, it's quite crazy. But yeah, Amir, if you have any thoughts, I don't know.
I think that's a very fair point. And on building on that, I think everything and all the names that we've taken here are all allegedly, reportedly, and et cetera, et cetera. I think it's fair to say that. Thank you for that. Amir, I'm going to ask you some questions. We've got these questions trickling in left, right, and center. The first one I'm going to take to you is it possible to work in media part-time? Do I need to dedicate a career to it? Or can I do it alongside other work? What would you say to that?
So there's production houses that exist all over the UK and London and all over the world, and they focus on producing content for different channels and for different providers. And of course, you get these channels. These productions are obviously, you can work on a project that will last a month and then you can move on and do something different. So it's not necessarily these production houses, they get jobs. So it depends on the volume of jobs, but you could take a part-time career in journalism. As I said, journalism or media is about you passionate about telling a story of something you believe in. So you can do that any time of the day, at any time of the year. But as I said, most production houses, they do work on a freelancer basis. They hire the crews they need for a production, and that may last a month, 2 months, and you can come in as a researcher, as a runner, as a volunteer, just to get in and build your experience. So you can do that as a part-time basis, yeah.
Salim, if you want to tag on to that?
Yeah, I mean, with the Muslim Vibe, we have 3 full-time members of staff, but most of our contributors are freelance writers. Most are voluntary writers, but we do pay some people who are experts in particular areas. But there is, I think, an abundance of opportunities. And what I would say is definitely just reach out if you are interested in doing something. Often it's media is, there's a lot of glitz and glam around the media space, but it's not a very lucrative business, I would say. And so, getting out there, getting exposure is really important, but don't always expect to be paid necessarily, at least early on. But building that experience base is very important, and can definitely go a long way further down the line when you're kind of looking for serious opportunities. But it can be done part-time for sure.
Very interesting. Thanks for that. And I think that that is similar in the US. And there is I think the audience needs to perhaps consider there's a hierarchy and a ladder, so to speak, in media as well. There may be similar to other fields, right? Engineering or medicine or, for example, law. There's a, if you enter law, you join a firm and you go up the ranks. Similarly, you may not expect to be at the top of media in the first day, but there is a path of progression, and there are different outlets. There may be radio, there may be print, there may be online. And with the online, there's so many different avenues that have opened up today. I think there's hardly any major corporations that don't have a social media manager or coordinator or something of that, or even a whole team today. So I think that's really important element of the equation. And of course, if you want to go into the mainstream, there's a route to that. And some people have gotten into that, and maybe perhaps that's something that one may want to consider. Thank you for that insight. The next question is, where is the most need at the moment in the Shia community in media? Is it religious, social, political content? And is this through social media or more traditional press? Amir, perhaps if I can give you this one. Where is the most need at the moment in the Shia community in media?
In terms of genre, you can really argue that every field is lacking. We don't have whatever's being done at the moment, and this, alhamdulillah, whatever exists as a service is providing a good service, alhamdulillah. But of course, it's not enough. And really, you should look at your own expertise, your own kind of fascinations, your own interests. It's not about trying to save humanity. It's about saying, what value can I add into this huge, humongous system. As you mentioned, you know, in media, there's two different spheres. There's the kind of the information and the knowledge that you have, and there's the technical aspects, the filming, the editing, the color grading, the sound editing. These are all technical roles, and that's matched with a very kind of research-based, more storytelling-based. So it's a very vast position, but you know, we really lack in a lot of aspects, be it in religious kind of educational content, be it for children, be it for be it politically based. So it's kind of it's all needed, and I would argue that priority is probably for children. For me, I would think children's content is very much needed, and I think that kind of when adults they can decipher between themselves, they can read, they can ask questions, but young people, you need to kind of make a concerted effort to reach out to them and to make some, you know, present them with something, kind of present them with something that they can consume and they can engage with, because you know, people go to mosques and speak to the imams and the scholars and whatnot, but young people, they need to kind of they're like uncultivated lands, as the hadith says, and whatever you throw on it will potentially grow. So you need to kind of be involved in that educational process.
Very, very well said. I think that's really so. So there's no shortage of places where people can actually start tackling. So I think maybe some introspection may be good to think about what is it that you're passionate about, and if you have a calling and a purpose, if you want to raise awareness about mental health, poverty alleviation, you know, whatever that may be, social injustice. If you're passionate about it, start wherever you are and maybe build from there, because we have a long way to go. I think that's a really, really good message. Salim, if I can give the next question to you, with respect to this, is surely the question is surely to achieve some of the things mentioned, such as dramas for Muslims, we need funding from institutions to achieve this. So how is this achieved?
I think, you know, we're quite far behind as a community in terms of appreciating this. And the reason I say that is from the experience that I've had and what I've seen as well, is that often it's younger people that appreciate the importance of media, be it digital or broadcast or anything else. And what I've seen at least is that the older generation, who are let's say the larger donors in the community, don't fully appreciate the importance and the impact that social media, digital media, these kinds of things can have. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. But I think we're getting there. I think slowly people are starting to appreciate, and you know, you take Ahlul Bayt TV as an example of it's become a household name within the Shia community specifically. But that's a process that has taken a lot of time and many years. And even then, from like a perspective of support, that's still like a slow and ongoing process. So I think, you know, like with everything, unfortunately, we're a little bit behind in terms of where we are as a community. And so we need to quite rapidly, I think, grow and develop, and organizations and institutions need to start thinking quite seriously about this. I know, you know, and I've heard many conversations that people have had about setting up think tanks and about, you know, launching different initiatives to diversify, even looking at from like a political engagement perspective, looking at lobbying and all that kind of stuff. We need to essentially get out in as many avenues as possible to further our agenda. So there is work to be done, but I think, you know, it needs for people to kind of consolidate, come together and really push this forward.
Very good. Very well.
Can I just come in, Sayyid Shabbir? Sorry. If you look at, for example, Netflix, they're carrying a lot of ethnic programming, and some other stuff. For example, the documentary Mehmet the Great that looks at Mehmet, the man who conquered Constantinople. You have obviously Ortugal or Revelation, I don't know what it's called. This huge Turkish drama that looks at the kind of the Ottoman Empire and the role it played, and it's a lot of kind of it has a bit of propaganda, but needless to say, it's not the traditional, kind of youth, or young people getting drunk and kind of the perception that people paint what American dramas should be. Rather, it does they do approach it with and Netflix carries these programs because obviously they know that there's a kind of growing there's a growing need for these kind of content. I remember I was on LB TV once, and we had a caller call in, and it was a non-Muslim caller. She said, I want to donate this £500 to the channel. I was like, oh, what's your name? She goes, my name is whatever her name is. She goes, I'm non-Muslim. I said, so why are you donating? You know, what's driven you? And she goes, I'm looking for alternative content. I've had enough of content that's immoral, driven, you know, kind of very, very sensationalist, very sexualized. It's all about fear mongering and pushing things down your throat. This is more about, you know, spirituality. I'm not saying, you know, non-Muslims used to watch the channel. I'm sure that some of them did. But the point being is that Netflix and other platforms would potentially air Muslim-friendly content. Now, it has to be somehow friendly, but at the same time, it can't be like where you're proselytizing, you're promoting religion. You know, I'm doing a documentary about the life of Imam Ali, and he's the greatest man in the world. They don't accept that, so you have to be a bit nuanced in the way you approach the message. You give a bit of information, you take back a bit of information, you try to balance the documentary or the program that you produce, so much so that they wouldn't see it as you trying to promote your own faith. Rather, you're presenting a picture of an aspect of history that is very fascinating. And that's why I feel like getting into the mainstream media has its perks, because then you will understand how things work. And once you understand how things work, you can then, because a lot of the production houses that I've engaged with, they're all ex-BBC, ex-Channel 4 employees. They leave mainstream, they set up their own production houses, they get commission from the BBC or Channel 4, and that's how they make content. You know, they've built that relationship, they know how things work, and they are very successful at getting content on those platforms. So I think there's a bit of a debate here, and I'd love to, you know, continue this offline with Salim and other people who are interested to kind of see how we can do that, because it's not, I don't believe in dead ends. I think obviously the work's being done is very good, but we have to always be ambitious and see how we can navigate through things without, you know, the need of raising a lot of money, but work with production houses, giving them a pitch that can work for a non-Muslim channel, and trying to, you know, kind of do it in a way that shows us in a good light, shows important messages, shows the ideal Muslim family, but at the same time, you know, try to give them what they want and balance it. It's very delicate.
Very good. I think there's a particular point that you hit on that's really, really important, and I want to share this with our audience because the history of media is very old and it's very pertinent. You talked about like the content that's being created on some of the new mainstream platforms, Muhammad, like these types of. I remember reading Thomas Jefferson's Quran. It's about the history of Islam and America, and it talked about particularly how were perceptions about Islam and particularly the Holy Prophet developed. And Voltaire, the French philosopher and writer, he wrote a play that was entitled Muhammad, Mahomet. That was a drama. You know, theater at that time was the cinema of today, the movies that are shut down because of COVID, but they have a tremendous impact in our society. And he actually wrote that that play, the book highlights that he wrote that as a form of criticism of Catholicism and its attack on Protestantism and the persecution that Protestants were facing in France. But he used the isti'ara, or he used the symbolism or the analogy of the idea of the Holy Prophet of Muhammad to actually criticize Catholicism. The proof and evidence of this is that the Catholic Church straight away banned that in Paris and France. But it took off in London and it took off in New York and in America. To the extent that during the Revolutionary War in America, between England and the United States, where France backed the United States, it was played on both sides. Until this day, the narrative about the Prophet was that false, fake character that was fiction that he created, but people couldn't decipher that this was actually him criticizing the Catholic Church as opposed to Islam in particular. Because anyone who reads that documentary or that play understands very clearly that he showed the Prophet as somebody who was a warmonger, and the Quraysh who were persecuting the Prophet and putting economic sanctions on him as the people who were victims. And anyone knows about Fateh Makkah and what happened in the conquest of Makkah. The Prophet, forgave everyone, and he was one who was the first to a peace treaty. But that sometimes gets lost, and in the public perception, these things wane. So if anyone has any question about the power of media and the influence of media, it's so tremendous that it may have residual ripple effects for centuries on end, which to some extent we're still facing till this very day. We have a slew of questions, and we only have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to take these in rapid fire, if I may. I'm going to go to Salim real quick. The question is, do we not open ourselves to criticism from other communities if we enter the mainstream media, that is Islamic conservative values in a very liberal space? So there's some premises and implications and assumptions in the question, but I'll leave that to you.
So obviously it's difficult to, as you say, it's quite a nuanced question. It's difficult to fully interpret, but I think fundamentally that comes down, for me at least, to a sense of security in our own kind of faith and our values and everything else. Yes, we are at odds. I think with the three of us are probably at odds in various different regards with regards to how we perceive things and our values personally. But that's okay. I think, if we're able to, if we have that confidence and that pride within ourselves, in our values, we're able to enter that mainstream space and basically unashamedly say, take us as we are. I think we are able to, and there are examples, without getting into names, but there are examples of Muslims who have entered into the mainstream media and have managed to maintain and hold on to their values. I think there is always that discussion and that debate to be had about, but does he really believe this, or does she really believe that, or are they not selling out, or whatever else? But I think there are examples, and it is doable. It's not easy. I don't think it's easy at all. But if we believe what we hold to be true, then I don't see an issue in being able to get out there. And yes, take the criticism, but you have to have the answers as well. You have to know your stuff, know what you believe in.
Very good. The next question, it seems to be actually towards you. It's been kind of in particular. It says, why did you make the decision to make the Muslim Vibe a platform to all Muslims and not Shia specifically?
That's an interesting question, actually. I think it's one that I've privately answered quite a few times, but never kind of publicly. So in the same way that there are a lot of Muslim platforms that are Sunni-led platforms for a broad Muslim audience, I come from a Shia background, as does my business partner. We're a Shia-led platform for a broad Muslim audience. I think, this notion of the Muslim Ummah that we have is one that, the Prophet has spoken about at length, obviously, throughout his life. And we've even mentioned hadith today from the Prophet, peace be upon him, about this. And so I think, there's an unfortunate thing where at least within the Shia community, we at times stick to our own. And we're very insular in the way that we do things. But I think, there's enough commonality between the different sects and generally as well, where, to the point that our writers, I don't know which madhab they're from. I don't know who they follow. I don't know any of these things. But as long as the content fits in line with a broad Muslim understanding, it's okay. And we do also explore and we discuss some of the differences. So around the time of Ashura, we had a video where we had a Sunni Muslim and a Shia Muslim discussing Imam Hussein and talking about the nuanced differences there in their understandings and their interpretations. And in fact, we're actually making more of an active effort in 2021. This year, to be honest, we had set loads of plans up, and then COVID happened, which kind of derailed a lot of the filming that we wanted to do. But we want to start sitting down, academics, scholars, even lay people, to have these discussions. Because I think what happens is that we have these conversations separately and we never kind of come together and actually have that chat. Now, I have friends from all different sects of Islam, and we have these conversations on a one-to-one personal level. And yes, sometimes it can get a bit tense, it can get a bit difficult, but there's that mutual respect and understanding, which I think is really important. So I think, being able to have a platform that's for a broad audience, that doesn't seem to alienate one side or the other, is really important. And I think almost a bit refreshing, because what I've seen at least is that often minority, or just, often one group's narrative and perspective is completely sidelined in the Muslim space. And yes, often it is the minority, so often Shia voices are kind of marginalized. And so for us, even just our presence in the space has meant that other platforms, and I've seen it firsthand, have had to include narratives. So around Ashura, for example, because we've talked about Ashura and the significance of Imam Hussein and Karbala and everything else, other platforms have had to highlight that as well, because they've been called out on it. So it's about, I think, broad representation and all coming together and having these conversations, not shying away from them. So that's why we did that in that way.
Very well said. Thank you for sharing that perspective. I think it will be very valuable to our audience to get both sides of the equation. Amir, if I can come to you on this one. Next question is it more important to be in Muslim media or wider mainstream media? You can feel free to chime in, Salim, if you have some comments.
I think I raised this issue before the discussion went live, and I said that if you can't, for example, if you can't set up your own platform or be able to kind of set up your own, because setting up a platform like, for example, LLB TV or the Muslim Vibe or any other platform takes a lot of time and effort, and it's not very, you need to invest a lot of money for you to become influential. And not just money, but it's just stress, time, effort. And if you can't do that, and you don't feel comfortable working with the existing Muslim platforms for whatever reason, of geography, location, taste, it's obviously it's very then important to start off your career by going into mainstream platforms or channels. But of course, as I said, it's very important wherever you work. It doesn't matter where you work. Islamically, you have to kind of understand your own principles. You understand where you stand on certain issues, and and it doesn't. That's kind of irrespective of where you work and how you conduct yourself. You can't concede what you believe in. So that's kind of a given. It doesn't matter where you work. And a lot of people work in banks. They work in financial services. They work in and they have to grapple with theological or reconciling faith and life. And the same thing with media. It's not like it's not like an odd place where everybody's like openly sinning. It's not like a big giant monster that we can't kind of engage with. It's probably, but at the same time, obviously, when I was on ABTV, we had a lot of people that started off their careers spending 2-3 years picking up the journalistic skills and then applying for jobs at Russia Today, Press TV, BBC. We've had people go to Channel 4. So we've had a lot of people that come, gain some skill, and it's a good opportunity for you to engage Muslim platform just to get a feel, because once you go and work there or volunteer, you suddenly are in the mix of at the sharp end of things. You could be potentially writing something and it goes online within a couple of weeks. So whereas if you go to the BBC, you're starting off as a runner who just the person who brings the tea and the coffee into production, and then then you're gonna have to, they might give you access to Google to some research, and you're not gonna be able to impact anything. It take you a few years before you start making any significant contribution to any production. But when you get to smaller platforms, you're able to really make an instant difference. But as I said to you, some of the platforms, obviously, that the Muslim platform, because they're small, everyone does multiple tasks, so things get, the quality is not the same, and the kind of professionalism that you see in big channels, they have huge, you might be working with 10 people that have between them 100 years of experience of media. So when you work with people like that, you say, wow, it really rubs on you. And so that experience is invaluable. And I would encourage people to do kind of try both out and see which one works for them, because both of them have a huge amount of value they can add to.
Very good. I appreciate it. There's another question. I'm trying to go through these pretty quickly. Is comedy a form of media? Is it halal to be a comic? As I have heard of ahadith saying making jokes is looked down upon. I think I'll just take that one, just some perspective. It would be in good taste, right? There's the story of Imam Ali and the Prophet where they're eating dates, and the Prophet is reported to allegedly have been eating dates and putting the seeds next to Imam Ali. And he said that, Ali, how many dates have you eaten? He's like, how surprising. And the Imam responds in a way of saying that, it's interesting that so it seems that you're eating the dates as well as the seeds. And so I think the idea being that, in good taste, you definitely don't want vulgarity. You definitely don't want anything of that nature. But tragedy and comedy are two of the oldest forms of human expression, going back to the Greeks and before.
Say Shabbir, it can be haram in one instance if the guy can't make any jokes, because then you're pushing people. You're pushing people away. You've got to be good at it, otherwise people will start cussing you. So what are you doing?
That may be a form of oppression, but
you're destroying it. I know, for example, Dave Chappelle is a Muslim. He converted in 1998, and he's one of the biggest comedians in the world, at least in America. And he's obviously, there's some of the stuff he says is questionable. I'm not condoning his work, but and when they interviewed him recently, I think there was a clip that came on Netflix about his conversion, and he spoke very powerfully about Islam and about God and about faith. So and that's deeply influential. But I don't see, personally, I don't see any problem being a comedian. And there's a lot of Muslim comedians that we've met and work with, and I think Salim is very close to a few. So, you know, it's and I think Salim wants to be a comedian, but unfortunately it didn't work out for him.
Thank you for that, Amir. That's not true at all.
Inshallah.
Allegedly.
Allegedly and reportedly, exactly. Should we promote? The next question is, and we're racing the clock. I just want to get a couple. I'm actually batching a few of these together because they're along the same lines.
Sorry, go for it.
One says, won't it be problematic to be outspoken through media in terms of backlash amongst the individual? I'm going to connect that with a couple of more questions. Should we promote media such as certain American shows which do present Muslims as progressive, but perhaps too liberal? They listen to music, have extramarital affairs, relationships, etc. I think Amir kind of highlighted some of that, and we kind of touched on that as well. That you know, it's not entirely a space where there's all vices, but it's not a perfect place either. I think there's a balance and a nuance there. But and the final element, or one of the elements, is isn't it more important to boycott the media? And we shouldn't be engaging with people who look down at us. So there's definitely an implication in that statement and an assertion that is the respected questioner's own. But I think there's a lot of sentiment there, and I'm going to pass that to Salim. Any thoughts on that?
So to address the last point first, if I can, when we talk about the media, right at the beginning of the conversation, I think we were talking about the media being a means of disseminating information to like a wide audience. So independent media, be it Muslim or otherwise, is also the media. Platforms like the Muslim Vibe and various others come under this umbrella. I think, you know, the approach of talking about boycotting the media in that way is, I would say, a little bit almost irresponsible in terms of framing it that way, because the inevitable reality is that we consume media wherever we go, be it newspapers, be it TV, be it social media. It's impossible to stay away from media. And so I think, you know, to bury our heads in the sand and pretend like, okay, this isn't happening is problematic. I think we have a responsibility, whether it's just as much as appreciating and understanding what we're consuming and how we're consuming it and just being aware, or actually actively getting involved and, you know, writing or producing videos, or just, you know, using your Twitter account to raise awareness about causes. We are a product of a society that is driven by media. It's not something we can just get away from and boycott, because to boycott media would be to throw away your smarphone and use a Nokia 3210, if anyone remembers those. I think both of you are probably relatively old. Amir is definitely old enough to remember those.
I told you about the comedy. He's got like the, you know, the comedian in him, inshallah.
Wow. This conversation is about to descend if we go on any longer. The other issues was about, so there was one about, you know, backlash upon the individual if we speak out, or being outspoken through the media. I think, again, I mentioned that previously, it comes down to having that kind of strength of character, especially when you're coming at it in a sort of hyper-liberal society, let's say, where our values are not necessarily aligned, being able to be strong enough in your faith. And to be honest, when I think about this, there's a clip of Mehdi Hassan at the Oxford Union debate, when he's asked on whether he believes that the Prophet Muhammad flew on a winged horse, the Buraq and whatever else, and he says yes. And like, you have people laughing in his face. But, you know, like that kind of conviction in those moments where it might not be easy, and yes, you can be mocked and whatever else. But then also there's various elements of backlash, you know, based on our religion that we can get, but it's about having the answers and being strong in that space. And the final thing was about, I guess, we're talking about, you know, the liberal, yeah. So Amir had spoken about, you know, I think, again, with regards to content that is kind of very liberal and whatever else, that's the battle that we're fighting. And I think, you know, like I said, I always think about, and Amir was mentioning about our younger generations, we have to be mindful of what kids are going to consume. And the reality is that, you know, from right now, we don't have any high quality kids content, I think, for Muslims. There are a few platforms out there, Hannah and Omar, I know one Malaysian content producer that makes kind of stuff for kids. But there's very little generally in that space. So the question is, in 5-10 years time, is anyone going to step up and change that? Because if not, we're going to be having the same conversation in 10 years and saying, oh, we need something for our kids, but there's nothing that's been done. So it needs people to I think, invest in these spaces. It needs people to come together, put their heads together and create the content. And it needs the community to support and to really engage with this stuff. And I think all of that starts from an appreciation that we need this. Because once we start, then everyone can kind of fall in line and do their bit. But the first thing is like, okay, let's acknowledge that this is a problem that we need to address. Sorry, I feel like I spoke a lot there, but I tried to kind of just answer all of those as briefly as possible.
No, well, thank you so much. You covered a great, I think you gave a great overview of that. I'm going to come to each of you for a last word, starting with Amir, and then I'm going to come back to Salim, and then we'll wrap up the show. I just wanted to highlight something. I think the comic question or the comedy question, there was a particular implication about being a comic as a profession. I would invite everyone to please refer to your marja on that, in particular to pick that as a career field. We're not giving any fatwas on the show. However, if you want to use comedy as a vehicle for something good, that there may be an opportunity to weave that in good taste. I think that's really what we were getting at, as opposed to a career. So please refer to your particular marja on that. At the same time, the boycott question, I think that's important because there is this idea or this notion of, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, so to speak, that if you're gonna completely boycott altogether, is your voice being heard? Of course, you're entitled to whatever you want to do. If you want to boycott, that's your prerogative, and if that's the approach you want to take, that may very well be good. In fact, people are doing that. The concept of voting with your wallet, like what do you pay for, what do you subscribe to? I was in the App Store the other day. Some of the top apps are things that are social media outlets that don't allow any paid advertising because people are so fed up of it. And I think our panelists talked about that idea that people are willing to pay for different content, new content, fresh content. Amir, I wanted to come to you for a last word for our audience about what do you think the media engagement really comprises and what to do, what are the next steps?
So for me, we are living in kind of really important times. Really, a couple of 100 years ago, Muslims were being persecuted for being Muslims. They were killed, they were kind of chastised. And really, we live in a time now where we're either living in America or Europe, where we have everything at our disposal. We have facilities, we're educated, alhamdulillah. Some of us, we have some wealth, alhamdulillah. So we are a very competent community. And this opportunity really brings a huge responsibility. This authority, this brings a huge responsibility that we need to use this opportunity to really articulate and use the media as a platform and try to somehow articulate our beliefs or our position to the wider audience. So it's really and truly, this opportunity is a fantastic chance. People sometimes, they misunderstand or they misconstrue the media to be a huge, humongous kind of evil entity. But really and truly, we can engage it, and we can be able to use that tool to really speak, and the kind of the proof is in the pudding. The existing platforms have millions of viewers, they have millions of likes, their content reaches, they get awards. So alhamdulillah, that is a kind of a huge, and really our aspiration is for the media is to kind of remain as they are in terms of like broadcasting important issues. But as I said, it has to come down, as I started, it has to come down to really focusing on the issues that matter to us, focusing on issues of justice, wisdom, truth, as opposed to just kind of, making sensationalism. So that is kind of our message to whoever wants to get into the media. If you do get into the media, make sure you carry those principles with you, and that way you can make a change.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Amir. Salim, last word.
I don't think I can top what Amir just said, so I'll let him have the last laugh, so to speak. But no, genuinely, I think I wanted to thank you if we get the opportunity on behalf of Amir as well, because these conversations are important, and I think it's not just about sitting down on the day and speaking for an hour and a half, but actually people putting the thoughts into action and seeing how they can do something with this information, even if it's just being aware and understanding sources. We spoke earlier about appreciating biases and where information is coming from and fact checking and whatever else. But all of these things, I think, lend themselves to the upliftment of the community at large. And that's what we're trying to do with all of this, right? So whether it's engaging meaningfully with the Muslim Vibe or other projects or whatever else, or just taking a more active role in your own kind of media engagement, I think this is fundamental work. So I guess thank you to yourself and the Mainstay Foundation for putting this together as well, and for the opportunity for both of us.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for being on. I should say on behalf of the foundation, we really, really appreciate your being here and enriching this conversation. Obviously, the views of the respective panelists are their own. However, we enshrine their ability to have freedom of speech, and they have given some great insights, as well as the idea of our focus here is to ensure that you are involved and at the table of politics, economics, media, and all of these different elements of the equation. And it's not to tell you to vote one way or the other, or choose anything of that nature. The whole focus of this series is in order to get involved. And I think our respective panelists have highlighted that exceptionally well. They've made it clear that there's so many opportunities in media to get involved. And I think what the brother Salim in particular had mentioned and brother Amir had alluded to is there's so much to do. And if I tie that in with our leadership conversation last week, these things won't be done unless someone takes the leadership on them. So find what you're passionate about, find what you want to be a cause for change for, and how you can bend the arc of justice in that direction in order to make the world a better and a more profound place. Media, as well as finance, entrepreneurship, I should say, as well as political and civic engagement are vital to the growth and the prosperity of our community wherever we may be. We'll leave it at that. We again thank our guests so much for the time. They have very busy schedules, but thank you so much for making the time. Thank you to our audience, and thank you for everyone who's tuned in. We'll leave it at that. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.